Hello. I'm not Emily Wilson. Very important. You can applaud later. My name is Joanna Stolniker. Can everyone hear me up in the balcony? No? Okay. Better? Okay. Welcome. My name is Joanna Stolniker. I'm the chair of LitHum here at Columbia, and I want to welcome you to this first LitHum Coursewide Lecture of the year. It's a very special occasion because it's bringing together different groups from the extended LitHum community. And it's not always that we get an opportunity to bring all of you together, so it's really wonderful to see all of you here tonight. It's also a special occasion because this is part of the launch of the Core Centennial, with more events scheduled for tomorrow and throughout the year. And so I hope that you will join us for many of those events, which are an occasion to celebrate the core and also to critically question it and to think about how we want it, what we want it to look like in the years ahead. I'd like to extend a special welcome to some of the justice scholars who are here tonight and their instructors. Thank you for being here. Also, the students of general studies. You are not obliged to take LitHum, but many of you have chosen to do so, and we're very glad that you have chosen to do so and hope that many more general studies students will continue to take LitHum in the years ahead. Welcome to Columbia College students. You are obliged to take LitHum, but I hope you don't think of it as a required course every day. And you're not required to be here tonight, so thank you for being here, unless your instructors made you come, but thank you for being here. Welcome to the Columbia alums. You are continuing your LitHum experience far beyond your first year at Columbia, and I often think of LitHum as a sort of extended intergenerational conversation, and the fact that we're all together in this room tonight is really symbolic of that. So thank you to all the alums who are here. And last but not least, thank you so much to the LitHum instructors who are here, my colleagues who have brought your students here. You go above and beyond in your teaching. You are so dedicated to this project and to our students, and I'm immensely grateful to you. It's a hard course to take, it's a hard course to teach, and so the effort that everyone puts into it really means a lot to me. Just a few more thanks to people who helped us to get the word out about this event, which is why our Miller Theater is so full tonight, in part, in addition to Emily Wilson herself. Thank you to Tony Gunthrope-Pardee, Larry Jackson, Bernice Tsai, and Joe Howley for helping us to spread the word. This is a really exciting occasion, not just because Emily Wilson's going to be talking to us about her bold new translation of the Odyssey, but also, as many of you know, because she has just been named as a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. She found out a while ago, apparently, but had to keep it a secret, and we only just found out a few days ago, so there's a real moment of serendipity here. Please join me in congratulating her on this superb and richly deserved honor. Now, before I say a little bit more about Emily Wilson, I'd like to say just a few short words about the history of the Odyssey in LitHum. There are very few works that have been on the LitHum syllabus consistently since the inception of the course in 1937. Homer's Iliad, Aeschylus's Oresteia, Dante's Inferno, and with one little semester blip, I'm not sure what the story is there, Montaigne's Essays. People often assume that the Odyssey is one of those works, but it turns out that that isn't true. In fact, the Odyssey has only been taught consistently on the LitHum syllabus since 1963. That's not when it started, but that's when it started really being taught every year. For many years, as many of you know, we read Richmond Lattimore's classic translation of the Odyssey. And just last year, even before it came out in paperback, we jumped at the chance to introduce Emily Wilson's translation. And I'd like to say just a few words about the significance of that change as I see it, sort of from my perspective as a teacher of LitHum over the years since 2002. One of Wilson's goals as a translator was to limit herself to the exact number of lines in the original Greek, to preserve what she calls Homer's, quote, nimble gallop, a great phrase. She also sought to preserve what she sees as the relative simplicity of Homer's language, or at least the lack of poetic pomp, and to avoid using archaic English, as many previous translators had done. This means that her translation is both shorter and more accessible than Lattimore's, making it a good choice for LitHum, where we face the real challenge of teaching the Odyssey in just 3 class sessions, or for those of you who are students, grappling with reading it in just 2 short weeks. In my experience, Wilson's translation is also beautifully visual. The Odyssey is a poem that places great emphasis on objects, as gifts, as plunder, as integral to domestic spaces and practices, and as vital to human survival. Think, for example, of the very technical description of the raft that Odysseus builds in order to leave Calypso's island. It's almost like an IKEA manual about how to build a raft. These objects stand out visually quite a bit more in Wilson's translation than in Lattimore's, in my opinion, capturing a dimension of the poem that is essential to its worldview, its poetry, and its meaning. And it's also part of what I find to be the beauty of Wilson's translation. Teaching Wilson's translation also affords exciting opportunities to bring alive the work of the translator in the LitHum classroom, and she'll be talking about this tonight. Wilson's Twitter feed, which I encourage you to check out if you haven't done so already, has been called, quote, quietly revolutionary, in large part because of the way it lifts the curtain on her choices as a translator. It allows us to witness, in an incredibly fine-grained way, how much care, thought, and knowledge, linguistic, aesthetic, cultural, ethical, political, go into each of her choices as a translator. And this brings me to the complex question of Wilson as a woman translator. I had originally planned to introduce her as the first woman translator of the Odyssey, as she is often described in the many glowing reviews of her translation in the press. But then I noticed that her Twitter bio reads, quote, writer, professor, translator, not the first woman to publish a translation of the Odyssey. 3 cats, 3 daughters, end quote. For Wilson, it is important to put several qualifiers on the description of her as the first woman to translate the Odyssey. She is the first woman to do a full-length translation of the Odyssey into English, but other women translators, notably Anne Dacier in the 18th century, that's my area of study, the 18th century France, have translated the Odyssey into other languages, and it is important to Wilson to acknowledge their contribution and to acknowledge the multilingual, multicultural aspect of translation. Translation is not just translation into English. Wilson is also aware of the way that tagging her as the first woman can be reductive. Her identity as a woman translator has made her the subject of baseless criticisms at times, sometimes by critics who haven't even read her translation. It is too often assumed that she and other women translators may be tempted to mistranslate because they are women, because of their ethical and political commitments. For me, it is crucial to emphasize that the ethical and political commitments of a translator, as a feminist or as an anti-racist, for example, are often in the service of a closer attention to the language of the original poem itself, and we see this in Wilson's translation. I'd like to take just one example, one that Wilson herself discusses in her translator's note and on her Twitter feed, and that she may be discussing in greater length tonight. This is the hanging of the slave girls towards the end of the Odyssey, the slave girls who are punished by Odysseus and Telemachus for having slept with the suitors and thus for having been disloyal to Odysseus. Wilson shows how previous translators have imported slut-shaming language into this episode in a way that does not reflect Homer's Greek. As a translator, she does not wish to further punish the slave girls for the fact that they were raped or claimed by the suitors. As she writes in her translator's note, quote, I try to avoid importing contemporary types of sexism into this ancient poem, instead shining a clear light on the particular forms of sexism and patriarchy that do exist in the text, end quote. But Wilson has also used this episode to reflect more broadly on the ways that literature forces us to grapple with moral complexity. Of the hanging of the slave girls, she writes on Twitter, quote, is their pain and their deaths and the horrible torture and murder of Melanthius presented as justifiable in the grand scheme of things, a necessary cost for the restoration of O's household in something like its original state? Maybe, maybe not. Important gray area, end quote. And in her next tweet, she continues, quote, "I think the capacity of literature to create these kinds of rich, complex questions or fault lines between what this or that character thinks and what the whole poem or story might be saying is one of the biggest reasons why literature matters. It makes us see, feel, be more," end quote. By that definition, Wilson's translation attains the ideal of great literature. It makes us see, feel, be more. With that in mind, let me now introduce Emily Wilson herself. MacArthur Genius Grant recipient and not the first woman to translate the Odyssey, she is also the author of 5 books, including critical studies of Socrates and Seneca and translations of Seneca and Euripides. She is professor in the Department of Classical Studies and chair of the program in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory at the University of Pennsylvania. She tells me that she is currently working on a new translation of the Iliad and also translating some dialogues of Plato. So she's staying fully within LitHum territory in her forthcoming translations, and we have many more great translations to expect from her. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome to Columbia.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I apologize if some of what I say overlaps to some extent with what you already said so beautifully. I hope it'll be slightly different coming from me, but there will be a little bit of overlap. And thank you all so much for coming out to talk about the Odyssey. So I just wanted to lay out a little map of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk for less than an hour, and I figured 12 is the right number because epics come in multiples of 12, but it's going to be very short. It won't actually be epic in length. There'll be 12 sections, but most of them will only take 5 minutes. So what I wanted to do first is because one can't really get a sense of a translation in the abstract, like any text, you actually have to read it, and ideally read it out loud in order to engage with it. So I thought I should start by just reading a passage from my Odyssey translation and then loop back and talk about some of the theoretical and practical questions that go into the production of a translation, and specifically this translation. The passage that I'm going to read may sound like a random number because, of course, this is a 24-book poem. I'm going to read a passage from book 13. It's not a random moment. It's the moment when Odysseus comes back home geographically to Ithaca. Of course, there's something in a way surprising, if you haven't just read the Odyssey, as all of you have, in the realization that the homecoming journey happens in a physical moving from one place to another so early on, and that we've still got another almost half the poem to get through, and yet he's still, in terms of where he is, he's already home. So I think that raises really interesting questions. As soon as you know that, you know what homecoming means in this poem is not just being in a particular place. So this is how he gets to Ithaca, which is by whooshing on this magical self-steering boat that his lovely hosts, the Phaeacians, have given him. A sound, sweet sleep fell on his eyes like death. He did not stir. As 4 fine stallions rushed at the whip and raced their chariot across the track, heads high, an easy canter, so was the ship's prow raised. The seething waves of sounding purple sea rushed round the stern as she sped straight ahead. The swiftest bird, a hawk, could never overtake. She sailed so fast and cleaved the waves. She bore a man whose mind was like the gods, who had endured many heartbreaking losses and the pain of war and shipwreck. Now he slept in peace, and he remembered nothing of his pain. So I hope you can hear in that passage something of what my translation is like. It's all in regular iambic pentameter, with a lot of alliteration to try and echo something of the alliterative poetics of the original. I did a lot of reading out loud as I was working on it, both of the original and of my own drafts in progress. I wanted in general to honor the clarity of Homer, the quick narrative pace, and to convey the precise, vivid details in describing the material world the objects, the boats, the water, the weapons, the houses, the beds, even when what's actually happening in the world is super weird. And in fact, even in archaic Greece, people didn't move around on magical, super fast, self-steering ships. But as you're in the moment of the passage, you should totally believe in it. I also think this passage is a way of beginning to talk about what the challenge is of translating a Homeric poem from 3,000 years ago into contemporary English. I have to carry my readers across unfathomable distances of space and time. And I hope that sometimes I can do so with so much smooth, ostensibly effortless energy that the reader, like the sleeping Odysseus, doesn't even notice how much effort I've gone to make this ship work. But I also want the reader, at least sometimes, to be aware of some kind of time travel whiplash, just as the narrator in this passage is aware of how amazing it is that this boat is going so very fast. I want the reader to have some moments, like that of Odysseus himself, when he wakes up on Ithaca, but Athena has put magic fog on the island, so he has no idea where he is. He's in his home, but he could be in the strangest island of all. I want the reader to have some moments like that, where you don't know, am I 3,000 years ago, or am I now? Or am I whooshing between them at tip-top speed? So I was asked to consider translating the Odyssey by a lovely editor at Norton with whom I'd worked on the anthology of world literature. They were looking for a new translation of the Odyssey. And I was excited to think about doing it because I've always loved this poem ever since I was 8 years old. This is me being 8 years old. I'm leaning down, wearing the shining thing. That's a tinfoil helmet that I made all by myself. So, and I'm being the goddess Athena. As you can see, I'm wearing the divine wristwatch of Athena. And I still love the Odyssey. I loved it then as a story which both allowed me to pretend to be a goddess, but also was engaged with these questions about community and homecoming and feeling lost. And I still love it, even though it's 40 years later. It's a beautifully rich narrative about questions I think about all the time, such as whether I actually am the same person as that. Is Odysseus the same person 20 years later? Can you reconstruct an identity that you used to have? What are the costs of that? How much is your identity forged by the people you're with, the community you create? Is it forged by who you manage to slaughter as well as who you manage to keep out of your home and the relationships you do have? It's about home, hiding, recognition, growing up, grief. And as I said, I love how it turns the details of the material world into these richly resonant symbols that define relationships. But of course, loving the poem and being keen to keep on rereading it in Greek, maybe even write some books about it, is a totally different thing from thinking it's worthwhile to spend 5 years of my life creating a new translation when there were already zillions of translations out there. By zillions in English, I mean almost 70. As you can see from this neat chart, the practice of translating the Odyssey into English has sped way up. In the first 200 years when people were doing that, there were less than 10 of them. In the second 200 years that people have been translating the Odyssey into English, there were huge numbers, almost 70, and the pace is speeding up. Since 2000, there have been far more than there were between the years 1950 and 2000. So it's a growing market, and it's also a market where it's not entirely clear to me that there's enough distinction between the different translations that it's quite worth the energy that it takes to do it. It seemed to me that it was not worth my while to add yet another translation to the pile unless I felt I could do something that was both authentically engaged with the original and genuinely different as an interpretation of the poem. So before signing the contract, I did the exercise of rereading very slowly Book 9 of the Odyssey, the part about the Cyclops, because I thought that's a good test case both for vivid descriptions of eyeballs sizzling and smashing brains, and all that's great, and then also a good book to think about narrative point of view and how the narratological perspectives in that book are in fact much more complex than you might think. So then I looked at something like a dozen different translations into English, and I realized there is indeed this tendency to simplify the narrative point of view and to do various other things that I thought, I'm not sure if I would do that. I also thought about how my experiences of teaching the Odyssey in translation, in various different translations, were limited by what I could do with the available translations. after doing that, I figured, yes, I would like to do this, and I signed the contract. So my first set of thoughts, which in some ways were sort of the things I thought, even if I can't achieve anything else, at least I can do something or other that's going to be metrical. So the Odyssey, the original poem, as you probably all know from having studied it, is composed in dactylic hexameter all the way through. Andra moi ennepe musa polutropon hosmala polla. So it's like that, 6 feet like that, all the way through. And so that hexameter is a 6-foot line. It's dactylic in that, as you can tell by looking at your own fingers have a long part and then 2 short parts. Andra moi, long, short, short. So it has that very regular musical rhythm, which of course is a function of the fact that this poem emerged from a entirely oral culture and is designed to be performed for illiterate audiences in a musical, rhythmical way. So then, what do you do about the rhythm? What do you do about the meter in translation? A possible option, which many English translators adopt, is to ignore it completely. And so, of course, there are many prose translations. There are also translations in rhyming couplets, such as the wonderful verse translation by the wonderful verse dramatist George Chapman. The man, O muse, inform that many a way wound with his wisdom to his wished stay, which I think is fabulous, and so is the Pope version. They both import an idea that it has to be about wisdom, because that's the preconception of what Odysseus is about, even though the original says nothing about wisdom. Another possible option would be to try to replicate the meter of the original in English. The only one I know of that does this is the Rodney Merrill translation, which goes, "Tell me, muse of the man versatile and resourceful who wandered many a sea mile after he ransacked Troy's holy city." And I think you can see both that this is a virtuosic feat and also that he's forced into some really weird language by the alien rhythm. Another option is to use lines that, if you sort of squint a little bit and you don't read it out loud, might look as if they were hexameter. And of course, the Lattimore is not metrical, but it looks on the page like a long set of lines. Another very popular option is just to use stacked prose, where it's laid out in a verse form, but it doesn't have a particularly regular rhythm. You can also see from the examples of these very popular translations that they were each reading each other. You can see how once one person does plundered, then everybody else who's read those other translations is then going to also choose plundered, even if that's not the only possible word in English for what the Greeks did to Troy. So I figured that what I wanted to do was produce a translation that would all be in entirely regular iambic pentameter. I wanted to choose a meter, the meter that seemed to me the obvious signal of metricality. Please read this out loud, just like Shakespeare and Milton, within the Anglophone poetic tradition. So that's what I did. And because I wanted to create something that would be in the equivalent meter to dactylic hexameter within the linguistic and social context of archaic Greece. I also chose, as we were already told, to limit myself to the same number of lines as the original, because it struck me that many translations were a great deal longer than the original. Of course, this is true not just of the Odyssey, but of translators in general, that there's always that temptation. You know this word in English doesn't correspond to anything exactly in ancient Greek, and vice versa. It could mean 500 different things. So you plonk down 3 things just to cover your bases, and you end up with a translation it has a very, very different feel, because it's so much wordier than the original was. So I wanted not to lose the read aloud ability and not to lose the tell me more quality of Homer. I'm avoiding the word page turner because, of course, this is a text from an era before pages, but it does have that sense of you want the singer to keep on going. You want to know what happens next, which I think gets lost if you let yourself add in too many extra words, extra phrases. In general, I wanted to convey something of the musicality, the clarity, the vividness, the emotional, psychological depth, the beauty and the narrative drive that seemed to me essential elements in my own experience of reading Homer. I also wanted to write as well as I possibly could, on the principle that a great poem should not be turned into a terrible one. An issue that arises for any translator of Homer is what to do about repetitions and formulae. This is a very repetitive poem, which again is because it's based on an oral culture, an oral tradition. Oral cultures tend to value repetition. It's the only way you can remember what your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers said, is because they were using these same phrases that you're using now. In a deeply literate culture like ours, I think repetition signals something extremely different. If you come across a text that's very repetitious, you may think, I'm reading Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein. And that, of course, is not the effect of Homer whatsoever. Or more likely, you think, this is kind of boring. I already read this. Why has this writer been so lazy that she couldn't think of another way to say it? And I didn't want either of those effects because they seemed to me so alien to the effects of repetition in Homer. So I decided that I had to do some kind of compromise whereby I would have some exact verbal repetition. I would have wine dark sea, wine dark sea, wine dark sea, humble slaves, humble slaves, humble slaves, the bread is in baskets, bread in baskets, bread in baskets. There would be some elements that would repeat exactly. So you'd have some sense that this is a world composed of these stable verbal components, but that I would also allow myself to play around with some of those components, some of those epithets, and mix it up. So that I would have a feel of repetitiveness and of stability, but without having a sense that everything is dead on the page, I hoped. So for instance, I messed around with the repetitions of the beautiful line in which Dawn appears, Orodudactylos, with her rosy dactyl fingers. I kept the same components within the line, that she's always a goddess. She always comes early or she's newborn. She always has flowers or blossom or roses. But I mix up what I do with those components. The question of verse form is related to larger questions about style and linguistic register. I aimed for a clear, readable register, avoiding archaisms, foreignisms, and high rhetoric as much as possible, to bring out the original's simplicity, its folk poetry qualities, and its speed. I know that some readers have wanted to label my translation style as modernizing or domesticizing or colloquial. I think that's part of the truth, but not the whole truth, even beyond the fact that most of us don't speak iambic pentameter all the time. There are also other ways that I wanted to mark my language as not necessarily always dictionary words type of artificial, but artificial nonetheless. For instance, I totally avoided all contractions, so I didn't ever use didn't or doesn't or can't to create a register that was always just a little bit off from actual speech. Homeric Greek is a mix of different dialects from different parts of the Greek-speaking world, from different eras, which again is a legacy of the oral tradition, because of course oral traditions happened all over the Greek-speaking world, and then the dialects from different forms of Greek got mixed up into these monumental poems. A possible way to echo that would be to do a mix of different English dialects, which would have been kind of cool and fun. I could have done this mix of Cockney with California slang, with Chaucerian English, with Miltonisms and Ebonics and text speak, and put it all together, and it would have been, Finnegan's Wake-like, and it would have been great for me to do, and I would not have been able to either to sell it to anyone or to do anything else. I wouldn't have been able to convey, this is an exciting story with deeply realized human characters. I would just have been showing off about how many dialect words I can get onto the page. So I knew I couldn't do that, or it wasn't worth it to do that. So instead, I just wanted to have a sense that every so often there's going to be a slightly weird linguistic choice. I wanted sometimes to surprise the reader. So having the occasional peculiar word, like ossifrage, as a nod to the linguistic diversity of Homer. Translation theorists like Antoine Berman and Lawrence Venuti have argued that translators have an ethical obligation to write in a style they call foreignizing. It's closely related to what is more negatively called translationese. Translation theorists often argue that foreignizing is the right way to pay due respect to alien cultures, to be hospitable towards them. We have to acknowledge their difference, rather than forcing them into the hegemonic Anglophone mode. On one level, I think there really is a problematic blindness in North American and British cultures to questions about translation, and to non-Anglophone literatures. I think the solution isn't always to translate all foreign texts into foreignizing styles. That seems to me the way to ensure people read even less translated literature than they already do, which is it's already almost none. Venuti has also argued that translators and their readers should make translation itself more visible as a process, rather than perpetuating the fiction that translations provide a transparent window through which the reader gets access to the original. Of course, that's never actually true. We have this metaphor in our mind about looking through the translation back to some totally different text in a totally different set of words. None of the words in Homer are the same as those in any other translation. I agree with that principle that, in fact, we should think harder about how to make translation visible. But I'm not sure that the creation of visibility is the same thing for every different possible language pair. I think in the case of modern novels, like those that Venuti translates, there is an expectation that the style of the translation will mask itself, will hide itself. If you've read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, you don't want to have to think, in fact, I read a translation of that book. You just want to think, I zipped through it and it was kind of forgettable, but there it is, I read it. I didn't read a translation of it. Whereas if you're reading a high status, is in the Columbia Core kind of text, you're going to have a totally different kind of expectations about what should the translation be. It might be, in the case of ancient literature, that you're going to think ancient epic should sound ancient, so therefore it should be in an archaic kind of English. It should probably be unreadable. It should be in this weird, unidiomatic, foreignizing English to convey how oldie-timey this text from back in the day was. And of course, there are plenty of translations into modern English, into supposedly modern English, that are making that gesture of authenticity by saying, if I use a weird or archaic kind of English, that will somehow prove to you that I really am doing a really, really, really old text, because English doesn't usually sound like this, so this must sound like Greek, which I don't think actually follows. I think, on the other hand, we expect ancient epic to sound epic, which means it has to be super bombastic. And we have to import all these ideas about what epic is that come from a much later period, from the period of the Homeric poems. We have these ideas about what grand, heroic military epic and military poetry is going to sound like, that's informed by Milton and Pope and even Whitman. And of course, that's actually an anachronism. Homeric poetry back in the day didn't necessarily sound Whitmanesque. I think my goal in producing a different kind of Odyssey translation that wouldn't follow either of those models, either the archaizing model or the melodramatic show-off kind of model, is not that those are impossible interpretations. It's just that they're not the only possible way to read or interpret or translate Homer. When just one or two very limited, debatable modes of interpreting and translating become the unquestioned norm, they can perpetuate uncritical readings of the source text and of the process of translation. I think, again, that this goes beyond Homer. Within classics in general, I think badly written translations are often highly valued because they replicate the experience of the struggling student in intermediate Greek class. So then it's got to sound that way because it's got to sound like you don't really know the language. And in fact, it doesn't necessarily sound that way once you get more comfortable reading Homer. And of course, it didn't sound that way to anyone in antiquity. I think in general, people in the United States certainly are accustomed to a binary way of thinking about translation that's sort of modeled on the myth of Heracles at the crossroads. So this is Heracles at the crossroad pondering his options, which are these two lovely ladies, one of whom is the more clothed one is representing virtue, and she's telling him, go on up the stony road and it's going to be tough, but it's worth it. And whereas the one wearing fewer clothes is pleasure and is saying, come to me, it's going to be lovely. And I think we have this idea that translations have to be either pleasurable, poetic, readable, but then they're unfaithful, they're kind of morally bad, or they're the virtuous, unreadable type, and that means that they are sort of good for you, even though you're not going to enjoy it. And it seems to me that that's actually not a good model for how translations, like what the choice is between different translations. For one thing, I don't think it's binary at all. I mean, even beyond the fact that all these bodies look more or less the same. The choice between virtue and pleasure within the painting doesn't seem like it makes any sense. I think translation is much more like this, that there are these choices about how do I create a responsible portrait or a responsible evocation of a particular item, a particular text, a particular face, a particular person. This is the artist Cindy Sherman, and they're all self-portraits. They're all her, and they're all truthful. They're all responsible. They're all different. Okay, so I think that in general, that the question for a translator is not, do I tell the truth or tell a pretty lie? It's a much more complicated set of questions. Which truths am I going to tell? Which truths will emerge most clearly from my translation out of the many true facts about the original text, not all of which can ever be conveyed in any version in another language? One of the most important truths I wanted to tell about the Odyssey was that it's actually really fun and easy to read once you get beyond the intermediate level. It's a gripping human story told in a beautiful, regular musical meter, in clear, simple syntax, designed to be comprehensible by illiterate audiences who performed out loud. The ancients enjoyed Homer and listened to the Homeric poems for pleasure. Another essential truth was that despite the simplicity of the syntax, the story on another level is very complex. It's not like these comic book depictions of the Odyssey. I've seen from teaching the poem, there's a tendency to assume it's a sort of old-school comic book superhero story about the unproblematically heroic male Western hero, whatever Western means in archaic Greece. I don't think it means anything whatsoever. Anyway, implicitly white, who is good because he crushes the bad guys, monsters, foreigners, witchy women, and understands the value of hospitality. You write down hospitality to get the A on the exam. And the story has a happy ending because the good guy gets back with the objectified heteronormative wife and regains all his wealth and all his slaves. So it's a nice celebration of family values, consumerism, patriarchy, war, and the superiority of normal male white people over foreigners and girls. And I don't think the poem is just doing that. I think that's absolutely a distortion of what's there in the poem in terms of the complexity of its ethics, of its social vision, of its narrative voices. I wanted to create a translation that would be clear about how many different perspectives there are within this poem, both in terms of multiple characters and multiple points of view, multiple competing value systems. The Odyssey explores on the most simple level two central Greek concepts. The first, you've probably all talked about this ad nauseam in your core classes, but I'm just going to go over it for 2 seconds. The first is nostos, homecoming. You might think this is a very simple idea about just getting back to where you live. But of course, as I already hinted at the start, homecoming is much more complicated in the Odyssey than you might think. Getting back to Ithaca is not nearly enough. It's as hard as it could possibly be. And there were profound questions raised by the concepts of getting home and being at home and defining what a homecoming is. Odysseus himself gets home only at the cost of losing 100% of his men who never get home. And the poem really emphasizes how the majority of people within the poem do not get home. And also how Odysseus' homecoming involves both reconnection with a few trusted members of his household and also the murder of a huge number of other people who also never get a homecoming. The second Greek concept is xenia, which means the idealized relationship between strangers, hosts, and guests. In this code, people have a deep obligation to take care of strangers in need. In giving and receiving hospitality, families form lasting friendships across great distances of space and time, and for many generations. It's in many ways an inspiring ideal, especially in these times of xenophobia. It would be great if the news had more about xenophilia. But the poem also shows us how exclusive the code is. It only applies to elite men, of course not enslaved people, of course not women. What happens when a woman travels is the Trojan War, Helen of Troy. And it also shows us how easily xenia can go wrong, as when Odysseus acts like a bad guest invading Polyphemus' home without asking, or as the suitors act like bad guests invading Odysseus' home without asking. Both cases, there's trouble that ensues from that. And what ensues from that in the case of the suitors is that they never have a nostos. They never have a journey home. To me, the original poem is compelling because of the nuance and complicatedness of its presentation of its core values and ideals. and how deeply it lets us feel inside the perspectives of so many different characters. I think that diversity of perspectives and that emotional depth can be obscured both by interpretation and by translation. There are choices about how much do you want to bring out that there are more or fewer points of view within this poem that are available both to scholarly interpreters, critical readings, and also to translations. I think there's a feedback loop between those two things too. A concrete example of how social complexity can be erased is that I was surprised to realize after publishing my translation how few times other translations use the word slave or enslaved person. Those words are very, very often, including in translations published after mine, rendered by words like servant or housekeeper or maid or noble pigkeeper, which of course converts the Odyssey to a world a bit like Downton Abbey, as opposed to a world that's an enslaving society. I think that there may well be systematic blindnesses at stake there. Maybe there's a desire to idealize the society of Homer. We know it's a great poem, so Odysseus must be a great guy, so he can't be an enslaver. So we'll just say he has servant problems, and we just reduce the number of instances of the word slave. So I think one of the primary reasons to love and want to keep on rereading the Odyssey is that it has such a vast, diverse range of characters and perspectives, and such a troubling, ambivalent attitude towards its own values and its own dominant narratives. There are fighting stories within the story. So I'm just going to read the beginning of my translation, which I think already in the proem, in these first few lines, you can see how the poet emphasizes, or the muse emphasizes, this is not the story of just one Nostos. It's also the story of all the other Nostoi that didn't happen, all the other people who didn't get home. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes, they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. I was interested in general in bringing out the expansive, imaginative, and ethical vision by which the poem is allowing us to feel not just for this multi-layered, multi-dimensional protagonist himself, but also for all those whom he visits, befriends, abandons, mutilates, enslaves, marries, checks up with, kills, or lets die. So since publishing while I was working on my translation, I didn't look at other translations for 5 years. But now, since it's been out, I've done a lot of little tiny comparative exercises of looking at little bits of other translations and sometimes writing about what I find on Twitter. And in doing that, I've realized much more deeply than I had before what a world of interpretation there is in just the absolute minutiae of choices that translators make. Very often there were choices that wasn't even fully conscious I was making a choice there. And then I see retrospectively that in fact I was making a very different interpretive choice from that of other translators. So for instance, I've noticed that many translations in English seem to present Calypso, who in Greek is a nymph. In Greek, nymph connotes powerful nature goddess who's particularly connected to a cave or a waterway or a tree. Nymph in archaic Greek connotes that, whereas nymph in English connotes nymphomaniac. And I think there are a lot of English translations which sort of import that false friend with all its hermeneutic baggage onto the characterization of this goddess who, on my rendering, is presented as totally sympathetic and emotionally intelligent and borderline scary, whereas I think in some cases she's a operatic heroine who's being dumped. I think it's a very different interpretation. Similarly, many modern translators make Polyphemus the Cyclops into, quote, monster or savage, and eliminate the ways that the text is pointing us to his humanity, which again I think simplifies the narrative perspectives and imports a modern idea about indigenous people, which isn't necessarily exactly what the Odyssey, which comes from a different colonial context, is doing in terms of its account of how the unreliable narrator, Odysseus, presents his invasion of the Cyclops' home. So I'm just going to spend a little bit more time talking in detail about, sorry, I forgot to click forward. I can talk more about complicated later if you want to, but I've already talked about that a lot. I'm going to spend a little bit more time now talking in detail about the enslaved people, the 13 enslaved people who are murdered by Telemachus in Book 22. And I know that you've already heard about them, but I think they deserve more airtime than they have historically gotten. I think this is a passage, the passage in which the enslaved people are murdered in Book 22, in which you can see very clearly how there may be multiple different points of view possible in interpretation of the original, which can then get erased or simplified in translation. So I just underlined in Greek what Telemachus says right before he murders these 12 women. And I realize that I've already you've already all been studying the poem. I want to apologize both for spoilers of the poem. Odysseus does get home. He is in disguise. He does reveal himself to trusted members of his family. Of course, trusted members of his family doesn't include his wife. With the help of Telemachus and the enslaved people, the enslaved guys whom he trusts, they massacre all the suitors, including the one who tried to be a good guy. Everyone gets massacred, and then the women have to clean up all the mess and get the corpses out and clean up the lovely furniture so it looks pristine and spotless, ready for Odysseus fully to own his house again. And then the remaining detail that has to get tied up is the 12 enslaved people who've been claimed by the wrong owners, which is the 12 women who've been, Odysseus says, raped by the suitors. There's some ambiguity, but Odysseus is not ambiguous about how consensual those relationships are. And then the one male slave who's been claimed by the suitors. So it seems to me that this is a passage that's about claiming the ownership of the house and about eliminating possible threats to the male honor of Odysseus and Telemachus, as long as there are items of furniture that are marked by other people's hands, other people's blood, or items of objectified humans who are also marked by other men's bodies, other men's hands. The house doesn't fully belong to Odysseus. So it doesn't seem to me that the Greek is saying anything that says these people are presented as actual criminals, having broken some kind of law, even an ethical law. I think there's real lack of clarity about whether this is about avenging a wrongdoing. It doesn't seem to me that it clearly is. I think it's about eliminating a source of shame. But, of course, in translation, one can interpret within there are alternative readings that could be possible in translation. So Odysseus tells Telemachus to hack the life out of the women with swords, and then he, for the first time, shows some initiative and decides that instead he should use a great big rope and hang them with that instead. And that's what he does, and I'm just going to trace through a couple of different possible translation choices so that you can see how it might make a difference just on the level of very minute detail what a translator is doing. So before he does this hanging of the 12 women, he's described as Pepanomenos. That's not a surprise because he's always described as Pepanomenos. It's his standard epithet. It connotes something or other to do with something's going on in his head. He has some kind of thought or cognition is going on. It doesn't mean it's a good thought. It might not be a good thought. But if you translate it as thoughtful or stern, or sagacious, it suggests narrator endorses what's coming up, which again is not a necessary reading of the Greek. But a lot of translators do go there, such that their narrator seems to be on the murderer's side. Another possible question for a translator is what's happening in what Telemachus says right before he commits these murders. I just articulated what I think is going on, which is that he's trying to avoid a source of shame. He's expressing a sense of shame and trying to make sure that source of shame is eliminated. I think what other translators seem to think is that he's expressing that they're bad, and bad in a very specific way. So we get these addition of terms of abuse, where there's no term of abuse in the original. These creatures is what the Lattimore version says. And then other translators are even more creative with it. Clean death of a beast, trolls, sluts, suitors' whores. And then you can see how the Lombardo translation is building on the Fagles one, the suitors' sluts, it's the same thing. And then the common scholarly apparatus surrounding this passage is also to focus primarily on how big would the rope have to be to murder this many women, which again, you can sort of see how there's this feedback loop between the interpretative practices of translation, the interpretative practices of commentary and critical analysis. Those can reinforce each other, and they can, a failure to question, is this actually the right question to ask about the text, may be reinforced by everyone doing the same thing as each other, even though the Greek doesn't say these things. So then a further question is, there's a beautiful simile in the midst of this horrible passage about gendered violence, in which the women, as they have the rope wrapped around their necks, are compared to doves or thrushes that are trying to go home to their nests. It's possible, I think, for the simile to be translated in such a way that it seems to dehumanize the women. It seems to suggest they're just birds, they're not even human at all, we all eat chicken, it's just, actually I don't eat chicken, but it's just fine, you don't need to worry about it. And it seems to me that that's not the only possible reading of the simile. The simile can also point to these women also wanted to have a nostos. They wanted to go home. They wanted to go to bed. That's the same that Odysseus wants. It's highly valued within the scheme of the poem, and they don't get it because of what Telemachus does to them. And then final detail that seems to me really important is that we have this horrible thing that the women's feet move, but not for very long. And in the Fitzgerald translation and the Fagles, I think there's this idea that they're party girls, and this is, of course, what happens to party girls. They dance for a little. They kicked up heels for a little. And it's a way of making sense of the narrative that suggests that it's okay to do this as long as this girl was partying too hard. And then the Lombardo translation seems to me to be continuing the language of the simile, such that they're birds, and they're still not even human in their death. They're fluttering like birds. So it seems to me that Telemachus' murder of these women is very, very clearly articulated in the poem as part of this very deep portrayal of a bullied young man who's grown up longing for an absent father, and who has, we've twice seen him shut up his mother Penelope when she tries to speak. We see how in the Wanderings of Odysseus also, how there's this preoccupation in the poem with the dangers posed by female mouths, like the mouths of the sirens, the 6 mouths of Scylla, the whirlpool Charybdis, who's all mouth. There's this preoccupation with how does the male elite hero evade the danger of being swallowed up by a female mouth or a female vagina. The obvious way to do that forever is the rope around the neck. So I think there's a sort of genius in Telemachus' realization that that's how you do it, as well as again, consistent with his earlier characterization, a sense of Telemachus' sexual immaturity, that he's not ready to stick a sword in someone yet. So I'm just going to read my version of that horrible passage. Telemachus then took initiative, insisting, "I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors." At that he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground. As doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests, but someone set a trap, they crash into a net, a bitter bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with a noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long. So while I was working on this terrible scene, I didn't look at other translations, as was my practice not to look at other translations, but I did do some sort of sidelong research into different methods of hanging, and I also wanted to make sure that I was aware of how long is not very long. And in fact, with this method of hanging, it's a long time. It's not long in the grand scheme, but it's long. So because that's such a terrible passage, I thought I should read something more cheerful. So I'm going to read just a tiny bit of what many people in antiquity seem to have thought should have been the right ending for the Odyssey. The happy heteronormative marriage, husband and wife back together again, with the olive tree bed test set by Penelope, where she pretends to have moved the supposedly immovable bed out of the bedroom, testing him to see whether he really remembers that he built that bed, and it's supposed to be a symbol of a marriage which could never be moved. I read this passage also as a passage where there's more than one point of view. I think there's a general tendency, both in the scholarship on the poem and in translations, and including by women scholars as well, to subsume Penelope's point of view into that of her husband. It's got to be a happy ending because they're together, and marriage is what women are for. I think the poem is actually showing very clearly that in this mythical, archaic social world, stable heteronormative marriage is great for the household and great for the social power of men who own the household. I think it also shows very clearly how miserable marriage makes Penelope and how little agency she has in her relationship with her husband. Within the olive tree bed scene, I think it's really important that Odysseus is constantly using first-person pronouns. I made this bed myself. I did it. I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and this is my bed. It's not our bed. It's never our bed. Whereas Penelope defines it as the bed that they shared, and she uses the plural and the dual. And so there's this idea of the possibility of closeness that she articulates that he doesn't exactly articulate. So I'm just going to read the final reunion, which I think is a very beautiful and painful moment when two desperate people who are desperate in different ways are rediscovering their radically unequal marriage. And I think it crystallizes the ability of the Homeric poems to show how there could be more than one perspective on this same article of furniture, this concrete thing, and also on this moment. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face, and said, "Now you have told the story of our bed. You made my stubborn heart believe in you." This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers, when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds. A few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. Okay, so the last part of my talk is going to be sort of a coda to talking about my actual work, which is talking about the reception of my work and about the whole focus on my gender as a woman and the particular ways that was covered and what different kinds of things that might mean. So it seems to me that the coverage and the focus on me being a woman was on one level great if it means that it's a reminder that classicists aren't all elderly white men. That's a good thing if people know that, and if that inspires more people who are not in that category to engage with the ancient world or ancient cultures or translation or poetry or history. I think it would be great if that's part of what that can do. I think it's also great if it's an inspiration to remembering that translators, like anyone else in an interpretive field, your social identities, including your gender, is going to make a difference to what kinds of questions you're able to ask of your field. It's going to make a difference to the kinds of things you're able to see in ways that you might not necessarily predict. But I also think there are certain elements that might potentially be problematic in some of the more simplistic ways of spinning that story. So I just wanted to go through the newspaper coverage by just showing you the headlines and how almost all of them had the word woman. 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 Women. Woman. 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 Could the Odyssey have been the work of a woman? No, but I don't think it could. But because I'm a woman, that's the title of a piece about my work. Woman's place is in the canon, or the core. This one I was very grateful for because it didn't have the word woman in the title. So it seems to me that there are potentially issues with this, right? That there's an idea that if we have one woman classicist or one woman translator, that's enough. And she's going to then have to represent the female perspective. And then all the other translations, all the other classicists, all the other historians, all the other ways of thinking about the canon, those will just be the whole range of other normal views. And then there's going to be a way of, in fact, limiting the options for people who aren't men rather than enabling. So I think there can be problems with that. I also think that some of the coverage didn't fully take account of the fact that being female in itself doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll have a distinctly female perspective in any noticeable way. Women can be misogynistic too, and very often they are. If you look at other translations of the Odyssey into other languages, we should both not erase the work of other women in the attempt to celebrate one woman. We should acknowledge there are plenty of other female classicists, plenty of other female Homerists, and also plenty of other female Homeric translators. We should celebrate their work, and we should also notice how different it all is. There are also ways that translations by women aren't necessarily more conscious of gender than those by men. If you look closely at the scene I just talked about, the hanging of the enslaved women, are translations by women more on the side of these poor women being hanged? Absolutely not. If you read Andasier's translation of that scene, she's extremely negative about those women. She really wants them dead because they're bad servants, and she wants to have the bourgeois household restored to its full glory again. So I see my decision to be conscious and critical about gender not as something that's sort of predetermined by my chromosomes. It's determined by the things I've read, the things I've thought about, the decisions I've made. Thirdly, this is 3rd out of 4, men have gender identities too, and I think it's a problem that they never seem to get asked about them. I've been interviewed about my Odyssey translation many, many times. I've also read interviews with other Homer translators, and it's striking to me that those others, like Lattimore or Fagles or Fitzgerald, they were never asked, so how does your identity as a man affect your translation? You must really like the male characters. And they don't get asked that, and I think they actually should get asked that. I don't think they should ask women that. I think they should ask men that. And then I think finally that the big story here is not that I'm a woman, but rather that this field of classical translations into English is extraordinarily narrow in the demographics of people who seem to be doing it. I think it's a surprising and appalling fact about Graeco-Roman English translations that they're almost all done by elderly white men. Even though, in fact, there are plenty of female classicists. It's not that there are no female classicists. There are plenty of translations by women into other languages. There are plenty of English-speaking Homerists in the world. So why is there this huge gap? I think there's a whole lot of interlocking structural causes. I think one possible element in that is that publishing editors may not all be like my nice editor at Norton and think I can reach out to a woman to ask her if she might consider doing this. I think many people, including editors, have an idea of their heads of what does a classicist look like, and it's not necessarily going to look like anyone except the elderly white man. I think in general that translations by women aren't guaranteed to be better than translations by men, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be worse either. I dream of the day when there will be just as many terrible, badly written, clunky, thoughtless translations of Greek and Roman classics by women as there already are by men. So I'm just going to, before the Q&A, I'm just going to have a final little coda to the talk in which I wanted to emphasize that I think translators have to be chameleons. I've talked a lot about my translation of the Odyssey and what I wanted to do in that particular project. I've also translated other texts, and I'm in the process of translating other texts. And I'm conscious of the ways that I actually want to shift gears or shift color for each text that I translate. I don't want to be applying the exact same choices for every text, when in fact they're all different. In moving from my translations of Seneca to those of Euripides, I very much didn't want to convey what I wanted to convey in the translations of Seneca about this big, booming, purple verse. I wanted to have a much more naturalistic kind of verse drama. I didn't want my Sophocles to sound the same as my Homer whatsoever. I wanted to have a very, very dense metaphoricity for Sophocles that I didn't feel was appropriate at all for Homer. Right now I'm working on my translation of the Iliad, and I very much want the mood to be very, very different. It's a much more intensely claustrophobic poem. In some ways it's similar, in some ways it's very different. The proem of the Iliad, like the proem of the Odyssey that I read you, hints at the poem's subject matter. It's about the terrible deaths caused by male anger, male aggression, a desire for status, and the mysterious wishes and actions of the gods in an intense plot where it's not clear where one action ends and another begins. So I'm just going to end by reading my beginning lines of the Iliad, and then it's going to be time for Q&A. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, cause of so much suffering for the Greeks, that sent many strong souls to Hades, making men a feast for birds and prey for dogs. The plan of Zeus was moving to its end, beginning when those two argued first, Lord Agamemnon and glorious Achilles. Any questions?
There will be microphones circulating. I believe we do not have microphones in the balcony, so if you have a question and you don't think you'll be able to project your voice enough, if you could come down into the lower part of the auditorium. Into the mic. I believe we don't have microphones for the balcony, so if you have a question from the balcony, please come down if you want to use a microphone.
Hi, my name's Julian. Could you expand a little bit more on the cultural dissonance that you encountered while translating from ancient Greek? Because obviously our society can't really wrap our heads around certain concepts that were conceived and practiced back then. So I just want to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a sort of question about, is anything translatable? If one culture is different from another, language is always intertwined with culture, is there any possibility of any kind of communication across cultural barriers, especially if it's a very, very distant culture? I mean, I think, for instance, right, I talked a lot about xenia. Xenia doesn't mean the same as hospitality. I think within the world of the Odyssey, the poem teaches you what does hospitality mean within the context of this poem, and you start to get your footing. As long as the narrative is clear enough, you can start to get a sense of there's something about the way that hospitality is practiced in this culture that's very different from what I thought hospitality was. I can see some components of it. It involves welcoming people into your house and giving them a drink. We still have that, but there are also ways that usually we don't sacrifice multiple bulls to Poseidon if we're trying to show how pious we are. You can see, I mean, that kind of thing I think is actually relatively easy for the reader to see. There are cultural differences here. I mean, I guess the ways that, just how is the marriage conceptualized? How is that buried in language? In Greek, an ana is both a man and a husband. A wife is both a guna is both a wife and a woman. There's no possible way you can do that, because if I say wife/woman every time, then that conveys something which is totally different from what the original does. The original slices reality differently. That I don't think is soluble exactly. I mean, I think what you can do is convey there's something very fraught about this relationship, and there are particular ways that it's fraught, but it's not like it's ever going to be exactly sliced up by the same syntactical structures as the original.
Everyone over here?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Sina. I'm a freshman in the college. I'd like to thank you for coming. Can you see me? I'm here.
I don't know where you are. I know you are. Okay.
Yes,
I can't really see
I'm
you.
here. Yes,
Okay.
I can come forward if
No,
that's
it's okay.
hard.
I can see you now. Okay.
Yes.
More or less. It's good enough.
So yeah, I'm a freshman in the college. I'd like to thank you for coming to Columbia. It's truly a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for your hospitality. That's great.
Yes. I'm exercising xenia, I think. So your translation is, I think it's an amazing translation. It's easy to read and it's great. So the question that I have is about book 24, actually. So we discussed this briefly in our class. And my Latin professor, Professor Alan Ross, he said that actually his hypothesis was that book 24 was added later to the other 23 books. I mean, it's the transition. Odysseus has returned to Ithaca and is celebrating his return with his family, and all of a sudden, we are with Agamemnon and Achilles in another world. I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Do you also subscribe to the belief that the book 24 was added later to the entire book, or
I mean,
who wrote it? Yes.
This inevitably gets
Thank
us
you.
a little bit into the weeds of the Homeric question, because later, by whom, what model do we have of the process of composition is all tied up with that. I mean, I said when I read the Penelope bit that in antiquity we have evidence from the Scholia that at least one critic in antiquity thought the poem should end there with that line that they are returning to their old rites of their old marriage bed. And so from that evidence, you can then say, well, maybe it actually did end there in some versions that were circulating in the Library of Alexandria. Maybe there were versions that didn't have this strange final book. It's possible. I mean, there are ways that Book 24 is weird. It's weird partly just in the way that it zips between three different locations that are radically different. We have the underworld and the orchard and the slaughtering battlefield at the end, and then we have a sudden cutoff point. I mean, I kind of, the more times I've read the Odyssey, the more I like Book 24 as an ending, the more I feel like it actually adds things that seem coherent with the whole narrative. I mean, whether or not we think, did a single person put all this together and then somebody else put that one in, or how many people created this thing? To what extent does it even make sense to say that belongs, that doesn't belong? We know that at least by the time that the Homeric editors of antiquity were doing their thing with the text of Homer, it was there. So I mean, it's possible that there were alternative versions, for sure, in pre-Alexandrian centuries. I like the way that the final books take us to this broader set of consequences. It seems to me that the Odyssey is actually not just about the oikos and about the center of the oikos, which is the bed, the house, and then these concentric circles of here's the bed, here's the house around it, but then around the house is the estate, and then around the estate is the whole community, and then around the whole community is the wider world, and around the wider world is life versus death. And I think that Book 24 takes us to what are all the consequences to this homecoming. There are good consequences in terms of Odysseus' dead bros think it was great that he got such a great wife. So there's a way that it sort of validates the final culmination is not going to bed with Penelope, and Agamemnon thinks that would have been really great. There's a way that sort of makes sense. In the way that it's about a poem about particular kinds of male bonding. We get both the reunion of father and son, and then all three generations back together again, fighting all together again. And that also, I think it makes sense that we start the poem with the will of Athena. We start the poem both with invocation of the goddess Muse, and also the goddess who's going to start this thing off, who wants to glorify her human favorite. Athena's got her plot. And then once she's finally got enough of a glorious, totally implausible homecoming for her boy and enough massacring that she feels satisfied with the plot, then she can tie up the loose end in this Dea ex machina way. So to me, when I first read it, decades ago, I was not satisfied with Book 24, but now I think it really works. I like it.
Okay. Oh. So I know it must have been so difficult to write this in iambic pentameter, separating from, what it actually might literally translate to. So I'm just curious how much time you spent on average on each individual line just deciding how to translate it, and what was that process like?
It took a long time, for sure. I mean, it took a lot longer in the first couple of years than it did. I got better at it. And also, this wasn't my first translation into iambic pentameter. I think if I hadn't already both read a huge amount of iambic pentameter by people who are better at it than I am, over the last, most of my life, I've been reading, formal poetry as well as free verse poetry. And then also just, I'd done other iambic pentameter translations before. I sort of practiced writing iambic pentameter before. But it took a really long time. I mean, that's also why I was emphasizing that I would do a lot of reading out loud of the original, as well as checking dictionaries and commentaries, and then doing more reading out loud. And then I would do a draft, and I would try reading it out loud. And even if it looked okay on the page, if it didn't sound right, I would realize I have to fix stuff. It was trial and error mostly, I think. I mean, I think a lot of the whole question of how do you try and get the right ear? Oh my gosh, that was so terrifying. I mean, stop talking.
Hi, over here.
Yes, thank you. I can't see you guys nearly as well as you can see me.
Corner.
I have no idea.
Hello. Hi, my name is Coleman. So while we were reading the translations in class, we noticed a few subtle differences between the hardcover copies and the paperback copies. And I was wondering how you decided what changes you wanted to make between the editions and how you came about, making those decisions.
Great question. Yes. So some of them were typos. I know there was at least one time when there was at some stage or other in the proofreading process, Melanius and Menelaus had got mixed up, and so I fixed that for later editions. So there were some things like that. There were a bunch of things where I changed things for meter, where even after going through this whole process of multiple different drafts, then when I was reading it all out loud as I went through the proofs, I thought, I don't like that rhythm of that line, so I'm actually going to recast the passage and change it. In the proem, I spent about a month doing a complete rewrite of the first 10 lines, and my editor at Norton hated it. I got rid of complicated. I did all kinds of totally different things. And I ended up putting most of what I already had back, but just changing a little bit. It was mostly things, both metrical things, and then things that were typos, and then on some occasions things where I changed my mind about something, where I thought, I'm not quite sure where I want to go with that, and then I would change my mind about just some small detail. I think there weren't quite enough for it to count as a separate edition, but rather than a reprint, but they were maybe borderline enough monkeying with it that the publishers were telling me not to do any more monkeying. It's hard to stop. Yes.
Hello.
Hey. Yes, thank you.
I'm over here.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
You spoke about the Homeric question
Yes.
already, and about the many different dialects that are in the Homeric language. And I just wondered, has there ever been a collaborative translation of the Odyssey, i.e. more than one translator? Is it something that you would consider? Do you think it would be valuable? Or, terrible idea, don't do it. Especially in the case of Homer, where there are many voices, as you say.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's the Center for Hellenic Studies has a project of the Homeric multi-text, where they have sort of digital project to include all known variants on the Greek text of Homer. And I think they're also pushing towards coming up with a database where you could click between different translations that already exist. So that would be a possible thing to do. And that certainly was not what I was trying to do in this project. I was trying to create a coherent vision of the poem. I mean, it seems to me that despite presumably having many people whose particular kinds of creativity went into the formation of this poem, because it's a folk tradition, because it's an oral tradition, it's not the product of a single person. A translation that isn't the product of a single person is going to feel very different from a poem that's the product of a naturally, historically occurring tradition. I think there can be very successful collaborative translation projects, and Homer would be an obvious thing to do that with, potentially. I mean, when the Norton people were first talking to me about it, they said, one thing we could do is you can write a trot, and then we'll get a famous poet to come and jazz it up. And I hated that idea. I don't like that model. I mean, of course, there are many, many translations that are like that. There are many translations of Dante that are like that. I think that suggests that poetics are not integral to what the poem is, which is absolutely antithetical to how I think about it. I think poetic form is a lot of what the poem is. So one can't sort of think separately about form and content. So I think I would have questions about, so which bits does which translator do? I don't know, but potentially it could work, depending on the team, yeah.
Hi, over here.
Can't see people, I can see bright lights, I can't see anyone. Okay, hey.
Okay,
Yes.
hi, my name is Opie. I'm a freshman in Columbia College. So you said you were going to translate the Iliad, and I had a question about, since you translated the Odyssey, how would that influence your translation of the Iliad?
I kind of don't know yet. I mean, I haven't finished doing it yet. What I thought as I was starting doing the Iliad is I want the answer to that question to be sort of zero, or at least to have a sense of I'm never actually, like all human beings, I'm never actually going to be starting from scratch in how do I interpret, how do I read, how do I approach this project, especially if it's a poem that I've been reading for decades. I can't actually be starting from scratch. But I thought what I want is not to think, it's not whatever choices I've made about the Odyssey are going to entirely predetermine what I do with the Iliad. So I actually spent several months going through figuring out, can I do dactylic hexameter after all? Or can I do iambic hexameter? Well, can I make a longer line work? Can I make a longer line that's still going to be metrical? Because I definitely didn't want to do a non-metrical translation, but I did experiments with using different poetic forms to try and figure out if I felt that for the Iliad I could make that work. I mean, one thing I realized in that process is that for me, maybe other people could do this. I couldn't do a longer line that felt to me convincing. It felt like I was always bogging it down with too many words per line. In whatever, I mean, I spent a long time trying to do it, and I couldn't make it work. But I'm also conscious of just even very practical difficulties about the Iliad that are different from the practical difficulties about the Odyssey. So I talked about how I was very much committed in the Odyssey to trying to maintain pace, trying not to make the reader think this is so wordy and boring, which is never something I think when I'm reading the Greek. And so I wanted to have the same number of lines as the original. But as I've been trying to do the same number of lines for the Iliad, I can't make it work. I did, the catalogue of ships was what broke me on that, because there's too many names. And unless you skip half the names, you can't make it the same number of lines in pentameter that it is in hexameter. I spent hours and hours trying, and there's just no way, unless I can use nicknames for half the names. But I don't think that's going to fly. So I realized I'm going to need a few more lines. I still want the pacing not to feel sort of ultra slow. I want to have some sense of discipline about not just adding in more words for the sake of it, but it's not going to be the same number of lines as the original.
Hello.
Somebody point to where that hello came from, because I can't see anything.
Right in front of you, a little bit to the back. Hi. 2 questions ago, someone asked a question about any revisions you made between this edition and the previous edition. And I was thinking, I know that it's hard to reach perfection, but it was in terms of creating what you see as a proper translation of the Odyssey. But is there anything in particular that you like to revise from this current edition that we have? Any specific passages that you thought you'd like to?
Well, if I knew that, then I would have already done it. I mean, I'm constant, right? I think probably what you have is as recent as it gets. I mean, next time they let me go through the proofs, then I'll come up with a new round of revisions. But I don't have a list in front of me of what's going to be on that. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry. So sorry. Hi. I'm over here.
Thank you.
How much do you think your choice to make Odysseus like kind of a morally dubious character was a result of you translating it in this day and age?
I think he's pretty, I think if you'd asked Sophocles, what do you think about Odysseus? He would have definitely, he wouldn't, of course, spoken English, so he wouldn't have said morally dubious, but he would have got what you were talking about, for sure. I think Plato would have been even more negative about Odysseus than than Sophocles would have been, for instance. I mean, it seems to me that the idea that a hero has to be admirable is a very sort of anachronistic Marvel DC universe Batman, it's not necessarily at all what the Greek model of a hero in the sense of more than human, extra special, talented, really good at particular things, could be scary. Maybe there's going to be a hero cult to this person where we're going to go and make offerings of some dead animals. That's a different model from fireman who saves little kittens from trees kind of model of the hero. So it didn't seem to me that it was. It's because I know the term toxic masculinity that I'm imposing this on the Odyssey. I think the Odyssey in itself has these ways that it's presenting all these different sides to Odysseus and presenting us with these ethical, moral questions about what kind of person is he. He manages to come up with all these different personae, all these tall tales about where he's been, who he is, what he's doing. He manages to trick and lie and scheme and murder and massacre his way to wealth and fortune. And if you want to survive and you want to be rich and successful, then maybe it's offering you a good model for what to do. But of course, it is also giving you the sense of there are particular costs for other people in this model of how to be successful. And I don't think that that's a modern imposition. As I said, I think that's a position that Plato would perfectly well have understood. And of course, Plato was not contemporary with Homer, but even so, it's not. He wasn't modern either.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm a freshman in CC, and it's actually kind of on the note of Odysseus' duplicity that I wanted to ask you about. So at the beginning, because you were talking about the repetition in the Odyssey and also the multiple epithets that are used to describe the characters, and at the beginning of Book 11, you note that Odysseus is referred to as the Lord of the Lies. And so I was wondering if that particular notation was simply to avoid another repetitive epithet, or if that is the actual Greek way of trying to convey Odysseus's multi-layered personality and how he may not be completely trusted.
Yes, good. So Odysseus is unlike other Homeric characters in that he has multiple different epithets. So Achilles is usually swift-footed, right? He's swift-footed Achilles, and then swift-footed Achilles, swift-footed Achilles. Even when he's just sitting sulking for days and days, he's not going anywhere. But he's always swift-footed because he's always directly to the truth and directly to the quickest way to death. He's going to run very fast towards that. Whereas Odysseus is always multiple. Like most of his epithets have the prefix poly, like polygamy, it means many. So Odysseus is both polutropos, polutlas, polumekanos, polumetis. He has these many ways of being multiple. And so that layeredness, that multiplicity, both about how does he fashion himself, how does he tell his story, how does he appear, who is he in this situation, who is he in that situation, he's going to be able to have a homecoming in which he survives, it lasts longer than anyone else, there's more of it, there's more of him. So in the line, and I do different things with those multiple epithets at different moments. The line that you're referring to is the start of Book 9. Book 11 is the Book of the Dead, it's the Nequia. Book 9 is the start of Odysseus' own narrative when he's the potentially unreliable narrator of his own wanderings. And he's described there, as he actually relatively rarely is, as polumetis. So he's much cunning-y or much scheming-ish. So there's a muchness about his cognitive abilities that's inherent in the word. And I think to me it seems significant that's the epithet that's chosen at the moment before he starts this long narrative, which is on a level of realism quite different from that of most of the poem. Right? In most of the poem, there are not cannibal people, and there are not six-headed goddesses who eat people, or non-binary whirlpools that also eat people, or sirens that are going to lure you to your doom. And the fact that in the later half of the poem, everything he says as his autobiography is clearly marked as a lie, I think leads one to some questions about his first-person narrative. I didn't necessarily mean it to be saying all the wandering books are a lie, because I don't think they necessarily are framed in that way. I wanted to use a And I hoped that the Lord of Lies phrase would have a sort of biblical or Miltonic kind of resonance to it. There's this way that he's both got this grandeur to him. Belial in Paradise Lost is the lying, seductive demon whose rhetoric you shouldn't trust. So I wanted to have some element of that inherent in it, that his glory is his brilliant capacity for fiction making. I'm not sure if that answered it, but there are many, many possible ways that you can translate the manyness on each occasion. So I thought I can explore different possibilities. Am I allowed to pick people, or is the mic still going around, right? I don't know. How about we do 3 more questions, and then we should wrap up. And the mic's
Okay, we have a
going around,
question over here, and then we'll go there.
Hi, I'm here.
Yes, hi.
I am Greek and I'm living next to the palace of Ulysses in Ithaca, Greece. I should like you to do me a favor, not to pronounce like Erasmus, like everybody in England or in Canada or in the States, but by pronouncing in the right way when you say Andra mi enepe Musa, not Andra moi enepe, because in this case you add one more meter, one more vowel that changes the hexadactylos. When you say moi, Andra mi enepe Musa, I should like you to trust more the continuity of the Greek language, which is much more closer to Homeric or ancient Greek than the English or German or French. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the tip.
Hello. I'm your new non-diegetic disembodied interlocutor.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. It occurred to me that this is the closest I'll ever get to addressing the core directly. So it felt incumbent upon me to get, to ask you, what do you think about the core? It's a weird thing. I like it.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, right? I teach at Penn, which is an institution that's very anti-canon. We don't have a core, and every so often the faculty get together and say, should we have one of those? And everyone says, no, we don't want that. and I can see a lot of advantages to it. I mean, just in terms of the shared experience that you guys all have, the engagement with these big, difficult texts that you're all going through together. And these big, difficult texts that also speak to so many questions. I mean, no matter what you think about what this text is saying about the question of what is community, what is homecoming, what is violence and aggression, what's marriage for, what are families for, what are parents and children for, like those big questions of what does it mean to leave home and come back again, which every college student has to deal with, is also there in the Odyssey as well. It seems to me that it's a really important space for asking those questions and grappling with these questions about sameness and difference, both within a community in a single time and in the single space of the classroom, but then also continuity and difference across thousands of years if we're starting with... do you go back to Gilgamesh? Anyway, starting with way back. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, there's part of me that wishes we had one, but there's no way that I could get it instituted at Penn. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think it's good only if it's taught in a way that's critical. Right? I don't think it's good if what it's doing is saying, let's all revere the dead white men in a way that asks no questions. Okay, that's fine. Good.
Hello. Sorry, over to the left.
Okay. Can we have, so we just had 2 men asking questions. Can we have 2 women for the last 2 questions? Sorry. Yeah, I mean, so the question is, what kind of lens, is there going to be a similarity of lens or of questioning about the depiction of female agency in the Iliad that there is in the Odyssey? In the Odyssey, as in the Iliad, Helen describes herself as dog-faced, which is an insult used both between men in the Achilles-Agamemnon fight, but then also used by Helen of herself. The question of whether, that was also part of the question, was whether, like, what do I do about the objectification of the enslaved women who are being passed back and forth as emblems of male power, is the ability to rape and enslave women. There are fewer long speeches in which women tell their dreams, for instance, in the Iliad than in the Odyssey. But it does seem to me there's an awful lot of room for not importing. I mean, I think, for instance, I just finished at least a draft of books 3 and 4 in which we have the great scene between Aphrodite and Helen, and the way that Aphrodite is sort of enslaving Helen and forcing her back to Paris's bed. We have the scene of Helen assessing all the different warriors from the walls, and Paris and Priam saying, no wonder the Greeks went to war for her. It seems to me that there's quite a lot of critical commentary on that scene that suggests the reason they went to war for her was she was so hot, and the narrative is going to somehow endorse the idea that, of course, she was hot, and that's why everybody would fight for her, because people are always going to have the male gaze. It doesn't seem to me that the text is saying we should be looking at her as a hot sexual object. I think we're looking at her through her eyes and seeing the pain of being in this position of being stuck here, and these men are fighting over her, and she's not able to get away. And I think the feeling of being stuck is there both for the male warriors, but then even more for the women who are constantly being abducted. I'm not sure if that's quite the same thing, but just that I don't feel like the text has to be objectifying women in terms of narrative, even if it's presenting a world in which women are being treated as enslavable or rapeable.
Last question.
Hi. In our Lit Hum class, we were talking about what a translation can achieve, and it was in between sort of what type of knowledge you wanted to gain from an ancient work. Do you want to engage with it as a modern audience and apply or learn stuff from it in the context we have today? Or do you want to learn something historical? Do you want to see what it was like back then? And does it always have to be a trade-off? Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
I don't think it necessarily has to be a trade-off. I mean, I think if the only thing that a translation is doing is saying, this is what it was like back then, and I'm not going to make it at all interesting, and you are going to go to sleep, but it was like that back then, so please write that down. I think that's not actually going to teach you anything about what it was like back then, right? The only way to really teach you something about what it was like back then is to show you are going to have real questions. You're going to care about what was it like back then, because I'm going to invite you in, and I'm going to somehow seduce you into caring about these characters and caring about this world. And then you're going to realize, wow, it was really different back then, as well as it was resonant with my own life. I think it has to do both, otherwise it's not going to do either. Yeah.